Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me for my session today. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here for this particular session, a session that talks about things that are, uncomfortable and things that we don't tend to discuss, things that are in the background, just looming around us. And I think it's really important that when we talk about physical education and health, when we talk about making sure that we serve the whole child and that we serve every child, we start to open the conversation around what equity, diversity, and inclusion looks like in physical education. And, these conversations are meant to be uncomfortable. That's the way we grow. That's the way we learn. That's the way we advance our practice on behalf of every child, right? And one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this particular subject is because it's really important to understand that not every student in your class is having the exact same experience, right? We know by virtue of this conference, not all students with disabilities are having the same experience in their classes, and we know to make accommodations and modifications for their needs. But also we have to think about the bigger picture, the fact that students are presenting in your class who might be LGBT, and they're having a unique set of experiences in your class. And our students and children of color are having a different experience in your class. And I think what's important is that we look internally at ourselves and at our growth around trying to do our best to do instructional practice that meets every child where they are. And that's a big ask and a big turn, but why don't we have this journey together and look at it for the next 45 minutes with a lens of understanding, hopefully, and of openness and growth. One of the ways I think I can help us frame a conversation is for us to agree on some language. And although I can't be with you there in person and live, let's talk about what we can agree on is one definition of equity that I think can help frame our conversation. In the upper right, in the upper left-hand corner, you see there the difference between what equality is, offering people the same things, and equity, meaning giving them what it is they need to be successful. So I think that's a kind of simple graphic that helps us understand and helps us kind of open the conversation around what's happening around us. So equity in the definition of the practice of providing personalized supports, and understanding that's different from equality. One of the reasons why we need to frame this is because when we're in schools and we're delivering content, we have to make sure that when we see a child, we see who they are. One of the things I've been thinking about recently, I happen to be a gay woman in society, and for those of you who were in Tampa at the SHAPE convention in 2019 saw me do a very courageous thing, come out in front of 3,000 people. And I'd have to tell you, whether you're 50 years old or you're 15 years old, it's as difficult as anything you've ever done. And knowing what a person is going through and seeing them for who they are is extremely important. One of the things that I always heard when I was teaching high school in a very diverse population of Black students, white students, Latina students, I always heard people say, I'm a great teacher because I don't see race, I don't see color. Well, we have to flip that script, because if you don't see color and you don't see race and you don't see sexuality, when you look at a whole child, then you don't see the child. If you don't see color, then you don't see the child, because that color and that circumstance represents who they are, their collective experiences. And we have to make sure that we do plan for the differentiation it takes to be able to meet every kid where they are from the inside out. Children of color are not having the same experiences that other children are having in our schools, as I said before. And I know that might not be fair, or that you might want to debate that, or that you might have a different view on it, or you might have political statements to make. But while that's all fine and good for another time, the purposes of our discussion are to frame what's best for every child in the lens of physical education. So I'm just trying to foundationalize this for us and make sure that, although we can't have an actual live exchange to some extent, that you think about where you're coming from, and when you look in the mirror for yourself, what is it that I'm doing to be able to address these pieces about my own personal growth, but also what's the lens I'm looking through. Let's look at the definition now for diversity. I'll never forget the day I interviewed for a job at Columbia High School in South Orange, Maplewood, New Jersey. I was a young 20-something, and the population was as diverse as you could be in a school at that time, in the early 90s. And when you're that young, I mean, back then when you were that young, it was someone said diversity to you, you were like, yeah, a bunch of different kids. Yeah, got this, right? And one of the deliberate questions that the principal asked was, so Judy, how do you think you'd be able to do in a place with such a diverse classroom, with kids from diverse backgrounds? And at the time, from my own references and from my own experience, I just said, yeah, I love all kids. Yeah, I can do this. And, you don't really know what you're saying until you actually get in it. And you're in front of a group of kids, and you have to make sure that what you're planning for is every child, right? And for a long time in my high school teaching career in health and PE, I did not do it well. I didn't do it well because I planned lessons from my own frame of reference. And there was a lot of what we call implicit bias in the things that I was doing. And it took me a long, long time and a lot of training in that district to realize that bias exists, that it's a natural part of who we are, that it's the way we frame decisions, etc. And implicit bias doesn't have to be a dirty word. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, as long as we recognize that it's there, right? And so for years, for example, and it's just difficult to admit, for many, many years, I was sitting in health classes and I was the teacher delivering content to a diverse group of kids. And all of the films I was showing had white kids in them. All of the films I was showing only kind of represented a certain part of our society. And years later now, looking back, if I was a child to whom I could not identify in the film, I'm thinking to myself, I'm going to disconnect. Okay, great. Heart attacks only happen to middle-aged white men. Great for me. I'm not that, and I'll never be that, so I don't have to worry about it, right? So some of the messages I was sending without sending a message at all was that I was kind of marginalizing and putting in silos my different sets of kids and really promoting my sense of my beliefs without even knowing it, right? We use words like white privilege, and for some, that's an inflammatory word. For some, that brings discomfort. For some, it brings debate around whether or not, because you're white, you have privilege. These are not things we're going to debate here today, but these things exist, and we need to make sure that when we're in the classroom, we give of ourselves and of our time, try to set aside our personal belief around things political, etc., and say, what is it I can do that's best for my children in this class in terms of the way they engage, regardless of their color, regardless of their gender identity, regardless of who they are or where they come from. And in education today, that becomes a huge, huge ask of teachers, given that we're still, very much in the throes of a pandemic. Not to mention, and I'll mention this in a bit, that we're in the middle of unrest. We have lots of unrest in America right now around issues of social justice and Black Lives Matter and all of the platforms that are out there and all the horrific violence that we are seeing that children are watching on television, right? That children are hearing about in their homes, and how we as teachers and as caregivers, in a sense, are able to help narrate that piece for kids and make it okay, when we know clearly that some of it is not okay, and some of it is very painful. And when you have friends in this era of being really seriously, closely, and personally affected by the events that are happening in our country around, the murder of George Floyd and all the rest of them, too many to mention, and the riots that are taking place versus the protests that are taking place. If you're a child watching this, and I say child high schooler too. You're posing questions about yourself and about society that are very hard to answer, right? And I don't have the answer to racism. I just don't, right? I just know that a presentation like this is something that's my responsibility, so that we can get the conversation started and we can get it going. My role as a teacher, as a supervisor, as an administrator is try to make life a better place for kids in schools, and diversity and equity and inclusion and topics of social justice are all part of that, And then we have inclusiveness, which is a wheelhouse that adapted physical educators know very well. I mentioned in my keynote about a story around the fear of being a teacher that does not know how to do this, and instead of learning and being of a growth mindset, wants to reject the idea that this can be done in their classroom in physical education. And it's straight up, making sure everybody's included. It's one of the ways that one of the places where I learned to do this well was when I was an administrator in South Orange. We did a lot around responsive classrooms and restorative practice, and I really enjoyed the trainings that I went through around that. Even simply the way that we set ourselves up, right? As you see here, there's a circle of people, and I tell you, it's very powerful to be in a circle of people and to offer the opportunity for people to have a voice and to speak, but also to be silent if they want to be silent, and giving them a choice about how they express themselves around topics and information and questions and skills that make them comfortable. And it's really important that we allow kids to be challenged, but to express themselves in their own way and to give them plenty of choice. And when you're deep into the work of EDI and you're trying to make sure that you help teachers along around this, no amount of training is going to help unless a person's ready to receive that message. And I've sat in many a restorative circle with my colleagues of color and have heard from them directly around how difficult life has been over the past 10 years, when they're realizing that there is an achievement gap, there is an inequity that exists, and the outright need to establish that when you walk down the hallway in a high school and there are level 4 AP classes going on and there's not a one non-white face in the classroom, and then you walk past a level 1 class and there's no white kids in the room, what are the reasons for that? When you go past the disciplinary office, the dean's office of a high school, and kids are waiting to see the dean of discipline, and it's all children of color, like, how could that be? Yes, you can say, if you get in trouble, it's because of your behavior. But what if a child doesn't know how else to express themselves, and they're just looking for that one adult to be able to draw them in, include them, care about them, be interested in who they are, and see them for who they are from the inside out, right? Because every kid needs you. Every kid needs you regardless of race, disability, gender identity. And you might think about that, the only caring adult in their life that approaches them in that particular day, on that particular moment, and it can make the difference of a lifetime, right? So this is what we mean by inclusiveness. This is what we mean when we say we're going to adjust our model based on the needs of the child, right? And I think about it a lot recently, because when we're doing student surveys for back to school and we're asking kids, what is it that you need most from physical education and health this year? Many schools are using that student survey out of the Shape America reentry considerations. And it really gets us to a place where we have our hand on the pulse of what kids are thinking and feeling. And that has to come to the forefront around our planning. A one-size-fits-all is never going to work. It never has worked. And it's a burden on the teacher to be able to become this chameleon of learning and this chameleon of instructional delivery around each individual student's needs. And, don't get me wrong, I don't want you to be a therapist, and I don't want you to single-handedly pick up the torch to solve everything social justice that there is to solve. It's bigger than us, and collectively we need to do our part. But I want you to be thinking of your classroom, your kids, your circumstances, and your ability to have the patience and care and responsibility and courage to be able to tap into your own growth around how we deliver the idea of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So, Judy, when are you going to get to the good part? Is there any good news? Can you give us some good news, Jude, about what this is all about? Because I'm feeling pretty down about the fact that all of these things are bearing down on us. Words like social justice, implicit bias, white privilege, racism, LGBT, all of these words that are bearing down on us. Where's the good news, Jude? Well, the good news is the one piece you bring is you, your caring, your ability to provide opportunities for kids in this profession that we love so much. And physical education in particular offers a unique lens through which we can engage all children. And when you think about what it is we do and how we frame our lessons, we can bring students together in a setting that's about movement, and we know what movement does for stress, anxiety, depression, etc. We know the ability for activities to unify children around activity and around play based on a child's particular need. And then there's that whole piece around teamwork and building consensus and getting kids to think dynamically as a group and a team to achieve a goal, which are all major life skills that everyone will need. So when we're planning these lessons about these unique opportunities in PE, the piece around social justice that's really important to keep in mind are these major strands of social justice. And these are things that are crossing over into education in ways that I don't think we ever thought would before. But when you look at this list and you think about what kids may be thinking and feeling, these things, some of them which are coming to the forefront and to the surface right now more than ever, are going to be things that you need to be faced with as we move through the fall semester and think about the information that kids are getting from a myriad of different influences, right? So all of these pieces are well documented, and as you go to plan, this might be on the minds of not only you but of your kids, and they might be really major pieces of curricula in your buildings that you might not think would have existed before. But, if you think about a class of 30 kids, you'll have kids that have issues of gender, ability, LGBT, English as a second language, English language learners, as we call it now, children from all different socioeconomic backgrounds, and when you think about that all happening in one class, you're probably like, what did you just do to me? Right? But it's easier than you think, right? So you're not planning objectives specifically and solely against these 8 strands of social justice. You're not planning lessons solely against a curriculum that's got to be all inclusive around equity, diversity, and inclusion. I'm asking you to use these pieces of information as the lens through which you do your lesson planning, right? Because the difference that makes the difference is you and your ability to put out there yourself and your caring and your love for kids in all the ways that you can, right? So we know the old saying about kids don't care what you know unless they know that you care. Treating kids with the utmost respect and care, it comes back to you tenfold. And that's why, for me, equity, diversity, and inclusion is so heavily connected to the work we're doing around social emotional learning. And so in Tampa, when I was there, I talked about how I believed physical education created an environment that fostered social emotional learning when it's done well, and that our life's work is around building up that part of a child's life regularly through movement and health and wellness. So it stands to reason then that as we tackle issues around equity, diversity, and inclusion, that we lead with the types of lessons in the social emotional learning world. And now could not have been a more appropriate time, as we seemingly have had an education system where the people outside of our profession have said, wow, it's really important right now that we take care of the health of every child, because they're really like stressed out, depressed, and anxious, regardless of where they're from, what color they are, what sexuality they are. They're all feeling different things around what's happening. And it's really important for us to really take care of the whole child. And all of us in health and PE are like, yes, finally, everybody gets it, right? Uh, and then you have the political pieces and the media pieces and watching people get sick from coronavirus. And then all of these inputs are coming in to a child's mind, and they're juggling a lot. And so whether we're talking about the experiences they're having at school because of their circumstances, or we're talking about, teaching them from the inside out, it's really up to you to lead with the types of lessons that let them know you care. So we know that that's all about the piece around social emotional learning. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Castle Competencies for SEL. There's a great crosswalk document from Shape America that connects these competencies to the Shape America standards in physical education. And when you just look at this around and against what children are struggling with around equity and diversity, you begin to see that these are universal skills. These are universal competencies that have its underpinnings in many of the lessons we're already doing. So it really doesn't just become, today I'm going to teach kids how to do the overhand throw for power. I'm going to teach kids how to do the overhand throw for power with a lens around making sure that I'm checking in on kids about their confidence and their competence, about their readiness to go ahead and do these skills, around their discomfort with being on display in front of other kids, all of those competencies. So when you look at this and you see how it's connected to wellness and connected to checking in with children about their comfort level, it makes complete sense that the two acronyms of EDI and SEL are pretty much married at this point in time, and probably already always have been and will always be connected. So, okay, Judy, I get it. Like, there's some issues going on in education right now. There's, racism and white privilege and implicit bias, and there's lots going on, and we're trying to navigate this whole thing. And in the middle of it all, I'm just trying to make sure I get through a curriculum and deliver instruction and content. So what is it you want me to do, Jude? I don't want you to change your entire life. But what I do want you to do is think about where you are on this journey for yourself, how you identify against all these different attributes, and think about what it is you can do. So the first is, how do you create an accepting and safe environment in your classroom? In terms of inclusivity, are you asking kids to be able to be part of that routine and part of those rules and underpinnings of how you'll run your class, whether it be virtual or in person? How do you practice culturally sensitive, responsive teaching, right? And I mentioned the example of me, like, I have to tell you, I haven't told anybody this, but when I was teaching health at Columbia High School and I first started out, I thought my idea of teaching culturally responsive health was to pop in a tape and show reruns of the Oprah Winfrey Show. I kid you not. You know how brave I am for being able to say that? Something that I'm completely embarrassed by now. I'm going to engage my children of color by showing Oprah Winfrey shows. As embarrassed as I am about it now, it was the only way I knew how to escape being inadequate as a teacher that was white, right? And how to connect to kids in a way that I thought was appropriate. Now, I made my attempt, and the attempt was okay, but it was completely inadequate for what it is my kids needed, right? So just a dose of reality there about where I was in my 20s. I want us to think about and learn about and value the experiences of others, our fellow teachers, our admins, our communities, and our students. It's really important that we get our hand on the pulse of the vibe of our community, right? When teaching and supervising in South Orange Maplewood, I couldn't be more proud of the fact that we were a very diverse population that challenged each other around race constantly. It was a conversation that we had every single day, an agenda item that came up as administrators every time we met. And it wasn't contentious, and it wasn't brutal, and it wasn't meant to hurt anybody. It was meant for us to offer our collective understanding about what direction we should go on behalf of kids. And it shouldn't take a tragic event like the murder of a black man or the bombing of a gay club for us to have these conversations. It has to be an ongoing education and not just something that's a knee-jerk reaction to a tragic event. And sadly, although I'm wishing that it never happens again, the tragedies are coming, and it's very disconcerting and difficult to watch. So we really need to get into somebody else's shoes around this, right? One restorative circle that I'm thinking about that I'll never forget, one of my fellow administrators, she was a principal, and she has a young teenage boy, and he's a young man of color. And she wept. She was crying in this restorative circle, talking about how she has to teach her son how to be stopped by the police, teach him what to say and how to act if he's ever stopped by the police. And I can tell you, I don't know that any of my family members who are all white, I don't think they've ever had to teach their white kids how to act when a cop pulls them over, right? There is a fear there around the way one will be treated, so that she had to reiterate for her son about, staying quiet and saying please and thank you and behaving respectfully, and just very, very sad. It was a very intense moment for the group to hear that she fears for her son, and it's very real. So how do we have more inclusive speech, and how do we act in more inclusive ways? We have to get educated, and we have to know what our growth is, our personal growth is around equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we have to be intentional around the ways we want to do that learning. It's sadly very odd that someone white is talking about issues of race and social justice. It's usually people of color who are saying, let me educate all the white people, right? This is my attempt to make sure that as a white person, I'm using my platform to bring these conversations to the surface. And I'm not going to lie to you, it took me a while to put this presentation together because it's very uncomfortable. You're afraid you're going to say something to offend people. You're very on edge about saying the right thing. But in the end, you find out, look, I'm just speaking from the heart, right? I'm not making a political statement. I'm not telling you what's right and wrong for yourself and for your school. But one thing's for sure, we have to act responsibly on behalf of every child. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this session and why I've done a couple like this. It's just to bring the issues to the surface, to talk about them, to say, look, I'm giving you permission to have this conversation, and it's okay. And yeah, this is a very delicate piece. And for those of you who have kids in your classes that you don't know how to reach and you don't know how to help, this is where our intentional opportunity to be around a growth mindset is most helpful. Now, speaking of that growth mindset, I've been learning about issues of tolerance and diversity and equity and racism and white privilege and all those words, all that vocabulary that we constantly use. And I've been reading up, and over the past 10 years, I would say that two of my favorite books, one, White Fragility, and the other, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, are good places to start. there's lots of content out there now, and lots of ready-made lessons that you can use in your classroom. I don't think that's the issue, being able to find resources. The issue is, the White Fragility book. We did a book study. I don't know, I was with a group of colleagues last year, and I got several pages into White Fragility, and it struck me so hard that I had to put the book down. When we talk about white privilege and talk about discussing race in this country, when you're white, you can get a gamut of emotions, from offended to embarrassed to ashamed. And isn't that what growth is made of? Isn't that what better understanding is made of? Nothing that has been worth doing has ever been easy. And this work is so worth doing. We've got kids that are relying on us, right, to be the models of society that teachers often are. And we're imperfect people. Everybody is. There's no such thing as the perfect person. And we're going to make mistakes. And we're going to say things that are wrong. And we're going to act in ways that we're unsure of ourselves. But if we are moving forward with this kind of work, with the intention to make life better, then I don't think you can say that that's wrong. So what I did was to read. It's a study. Opened conversations with people that challenged my thinking. And I've investigated my own bias, which is a very difficult thing to do. Self-reflection is so incredibly important in this kind of work. And pulling yourself out of your comfort zone is there's no other way to do this work than to pull yourself out of your own comfort zone. So really, really important to look through a lens of diversity and understand that it's not just physical education that you're teaching. It's not just students that you're teaching. And when you look at your roster, know who your children are, right? And we're not just talking about students with disabilities, or as Jody Duff says, differabilities. Love that word, by the way. We're talking and thinking about what it means to be the child that these children are. Girls, boys, LGBT, gender identity, white, black, English speaking, non-English speaking. It's really important that we rely on our ability to connect with them through our relationships before we talk about instruction. And I think seeking first to understand really put your best foot forward around letting kids know, no matter what circumstances they are in, that you will always be there for them, right? And that's why I've been distinguishing lately over the past 6 months of the pandemic, being a teacher of children versus being a teacher of health and physical education. So it's always a teacher of children first. It's always a teacher of children and their needs and meeting that need first. Then we're teaching physical education. Because if you've got a kid coming into class worried about walking down the block at night on their own street, I don't know how ready they're going to be to accept information about whatever content you're giving them, right? Particularly since this pandemic hit, it was clear to me that there is something bigger going on here for teachers that needs to be addressed than our content, right? So I don't want you to narrate what I'm saying as Judy no longer cares about the competencies of health and physical education. No, not what I'm saying. Physical literacy and health literacy is what we do, right? Equity, diversity, and inclusion, compassion, the building of relationships, the way to communicate, the selections of lessons, and the ability to have a teacher script around what you're saying. That's the how that's so very important. The what, we know. You're certified and you're a professional and you're the pro on student wellness in your schools. That's not what I'm talking about. That's the what. The other X factor you're bringing to teaching is the compassion piece, right? It's the ability to see children and really see who they are. And it brings me back to my opening statement around, we can't walk around schools saying we don't see color. You need to see color. You need to see all the colors, because if you don't see color, you don't see the child. If you don't see LGBT, then you don't see the child. there is so much going on inside of each one of them, and we need to remember to, again, think about teaching them from the inside out. Their willingness and readiness to be able to accept whatever you have to say starts with the building of those relationships. And however long that takes, it takes, but it needs to happen. And so seeking first to understand really comes to the forefront, and making sure that no matter how much time it takes to build the relationship, we know that for the rest of the time we have them, there'll be a shared understanding about the culture of your classroom, the respect that's required, the empathy that's required, the comfort level that's required around who shares and who doesn't, and having that all be okay. So like many other webinars I've been to over the past 7 or 8 months, there's always this one slide with all of the fun clickables. I call them clickables. Is that a word? I don't know, but I call them the clickables. Now, at the time that I'm uploading this PowerPoint, I don't know if you're able to click on this screen and get these resources. So I'll make sure that DAPE has these clickable resources. And if clickable is not a word, clickables, I just made up the word. There's now a new word, clickables. And these slides are just the most fun. Whenever I've been in webinars and been in chat boxes where people are adding clickables, I'm like, yes, add this to my folder. I love it. The bigger the toolbox gets, the better off we're going to be. And although I'm offering just a few clickables here, the ones that help you, great. The ones that you can't use and are just not a good fit, that's okay too. I don't think we hear that very often, but to the extent to which these help, then absolutely. Here's a couple of pieces from the cbhpe.org website. Thank you to the foamers, and a really cool rating scale that asks questions about your inclusivity tool in PE, and to raise awareness for the teacher around that. So I've included that. That's also under the cbhpe.org. And then there's been a really great piece from Jopard from Shape America that I would start with, called the AZ on social justice and physical education. Just a few of many places to start. And then, of course, a very famous website. I don't know, the clearinghouse for all things strategies and resources and planning, Tolerance.org. You're probably familiar with this one already, but lots of training and workshops and posters and things that you can use. You know, getting into this work and just making the attempt is really important, because it shows kids that you value this kind of work. It shows them that you're making an effort to be able to seek to understand their struggles and their daily life in all of this. You know, I remember many times when I was at Columbia and issues would come. You know what? One big piece that comes up that reminds me of this work is that when I was teaching, I was a young teacher. Wow. I can't believe it was that long ago, but the O.J. Simpson case, do you remember that? O.J. Simpson case, the verdict was being announced. It was in the morning, like mid-morning. And all of Columbia High School was like, I don't know, there was a different feeling. And when the verdict was being announced, it was like 10 in the morning. It was announced that he was not guilty. All over the building, you could hear cheers of hooray. I mean, kids were screaming, they were freaking, they were jumping around. That was a big moment at Columbia High School. Now, as a teacher, you had to navigate and pivot what the next class was going to bring, because kids were reacting to this news. Same thing when Barack Obama was elected president. There was a lot of emotion around him becoming president. It was a big deal, right? And being able to adjust your instruction to be able to make sure that kids could express themselves around that. So there you go. And not that we're talking politics or, you know, talking things past, but just one of many examples of daily life that are real around making sure that we can teach in a responsive way. I can remember regularly that when I planned lessons, it didn't quite come out the way I thought it would. And many teachable moments intersected, particularly in health ed, where I had to go off the track and say, okay, if this is where you guys want to go, let's go, kids. Let's go on this track at the high school level, because it's obvious that there is a pulse in the room that needs to talk about it, right? It's like when you go back to school this year, not talking about the COVID pandemic, which is right in front of them, and the fact that they've been in isolation for so long, like ignoring that completely has got to be irresponsible. I'm sorry, but kids have feelings about that, and we got to get to the heart of that. And as wellness instructors and as certified professionals in this field, we have got to get to the thoughts, the feelings, and the beliefs of every child in order to help them embrace who they are, in order to help them be more confident about their beliefs, in order to help them raise the level of self-esteem when they look in the mirror and say, I am worthy and I am loved and I am worthy of love. We're part of that journey. We are part of that journey. So it's really, really critical that we look at these pieces around who we are as teachers, right? And that starts with our own self-work, right? That starts with our own self-work. So in closing, there is this thing called equity, diversity, and inclusion, and there is this related collaboration around teaching social emotional learning that are married to each other and are bridges for each other to help a teacher plan their lessons through a lens that includes all children. And regardless of whether a child is from a particular place, loves a particular person, is of a particular color, we have to see those attributes of children and make sure that we are planning for and delivering a message that is all inclusive. I think we have to continue the conversation, and that we're pretty far away from figuring it all out. But we would be irresponsible if we didn't know that this was the type of instructional delivery that children need. We can't turn a blind eye to it, and we can't ignore our own growth around equity, diversity, and inclusion. I have white privilege, I have implicit bias, and I want to be able to leverage those things to do good in this world. And you might disagree, and that's okay. That's where I am in my journey, and I'm striving to learn more and to be more compassionate around all that's happening. It's not just enough for me to have sat and cried over the video I saw of George Floyd. It's not enough for me to have been jolted out of my seat to watch a man get shot 7 times in the back. These are unbelievably horrific. It's horrific. I'm speechless, right? No one deserves to be treated that way, right? And if we can produce and foster a culture in our classrooms by modeling the kind of inclusiveness and caring and humanity and empathy that we want to see in kids, then maybe we could get a little closer to where we want to be, right? So I do hope that this session was helpful to you. I hope the resources are helpful to you. I can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming today to this session. I know it's a tough session, tough for me too. I'm going to take a deep breath after I stop recording. And I just want to thank DAPE for inviting me to this great conference and to this great workshop, and to all the leaders who have done the work to get us here. I wish for you a continued great school year. Thank you so much for loving every child unconditionally and meeting them where they are. I appreciate it a lot. There's my contact information if you want to follow me on Twitter, or please email me if you want to know more. Thank you so much, and be well.